Thank you very much for having me today. I'll be talking a bit about viral hate and digital propaganda on the far right and how the far right uses populism, how this is a populism that has been around for longer than the internet, but through the internet and social media is reaching new audiences and activating people and mobilizing voters in new ways. We've only got 15 minutes, so I'll only be scratching the surface of the kind of stuff we sort of deal with every day at the Amadeu Antonio Foundation. Very quickly, who was Amadeu Antonio? He was a contract worker in the GDR, a so-called contract worker, because the working conditions were very exploitative and brutal. He came from Angola, and after the wall fell, he was one of the first victims of far-right violence in the newly reunified Germany. He was murdered by neo-Nazis. Our organization counts the number of deaths by the far right. Since 1990, currently we're at 219 deaths of right-wing violence. And I think that since Amadeu Antonio was murdered, we've seen an evolving threat. The threat's still there. In the 90s, refugee homes were being set alight. To a certain extent, this is still happening now in 2015 and more recently with Ukrainian refugees. We're seeing that conspiracy narratives that were around in the far right before are reaching new audiences online. And we're just seeing the threat change with the rise of image boards, Telegram channels, Discord servers, and of course, through traditional social media like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So, like I said, populism in the far right, it's been around before the internet. There's the famous poster by Die Republikaner in the early 90s, I believe. Das Boot ist voll. And this was a slogan that actually sadly gained a lot of resonance leading up to the riots and pogroms in cities like Rostock-Lichtenhagen at the beginning of the 90s, where even some of the more traditional center media, for example, Spiegel, was also using this term, Das Boot ist voll, the boat is full. It's already a very emotive metaphor that suggests that we might sink, our lives are in danger. It sort of suggests that there's basically an existential threat posed by refugees coming over. And this is something that was influential, came from the far right, but like I said, was adopted by more mainstream papers. Then we have Maria statt Sharia, so Maria instead of Sharia law by the neo-Nazi party NPD, which is now calling itself Die Heimat, by the way. So here we have a very classic anti-Muslim sentiment. Or we have the neo-Nazi party Die Rechte, Israel ist unser Unglück, Israel is our misfortune, which is a play on Heinrich von Treitschke's famous maxim, which was adopted by the Nazis, which is that the Jews are our misfortune, which here Die Rechte have just replaced Jews with Zionism in Israel. And for like a small local election campaign, it's quite a wild populist slogan to say we're going to stop Zionism as our primary election goal. So this is just sort of like an idea of the election posters that parties were using before social media and the internet. I think you can always usually tell how racist or far right a particular neighborhood is by how high the election posters of far right parties have to be hung. In Neukölln or Kreuzberg or other areas of Berlin, for example, you wouldn't see an NPD poster. Someone would probably tear it down straight away. In other areas, these far-right posters are hung quite high on streetlights, but there are also large swathes of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Saxony, Thuringia, where you could hang these posters fairly low down and there's no real risk of anyone sort of intervening, I would say. This has obviously changed with social media because the images are there, you can't tear them down, they're available to everyone, not just in a particular region where there's no kind of a resistance or people speaking out against it. When things go viral, they can reach people in new ways that traditional election posters can't. Here's an example from Britain using like a populist sentiment, and this was used online as well a lot. Breaking point. We have here queues of migrants, refugees. There's this narrative that the EU has failed us all, and this was used by Nigel Farage here, who was head of the UKIP party in Britain, later Brexit party, and his lifelong dream was essentially of a Brexit, which later then came to fruition, as we know, and it was very racistly charged, which is an important part of populism, which I'll get onto in a sec. Interestingly, this is an election campaign in Hungary, and Viktor Orbán from Fidesz used exactly the same image in his populist far-right rhetoric and narrative of closing borders, being tough on migration and refugees. And throughout the pandemic, we also saw a rise of populism on the streets and also online through the Querdenken movement. Here we have the criminalization of supposed elites, here we have politicians, Lauterbach, Merkel, and Spahn, but there were also posters saying guilty with people like the comedian Jan Böhmermann, with other scientists, journalists, etc. So there's this idea of holding the elites to power, of criminalizing them, of seeing them as the main enemy within far-right populism. For the rest of the presentation, like I said, we'll be scratching the surface. I'm just going to take the AFD as an example of how we got from these classic far-right posters of the boat is full, Maria instead of Sharia, or Israel is our misfortune. These were like classic neo-Nazi slogans, but the threat of the far right has evolved and changed, like I said, at the beginning, since the 90s. And I would like to focus on the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, as a case example of how these populist narratives are now used on social media through share pics, through online campaigns, to basically spread their message, to spread hate, and to push forward a certain anti-Muslim, anti-migrant narrative. But before I go on, what do I mean by far-right populism? I mean, there's a lot of definitions of populism, also of far-right populism. For the sake of this presentation, I'd like to just define a few points of what I really mean. I would say it's an ideology of us, the people, versus them, the elites, the establishment. So it really is like a battle of like two groups, the in-group and the out-group. There's a rhetoric of over-foreignization, which is a threat to the people. So we saw this with the idea of the boat being full, we're going to start rocking, we might sink, there's a threat to us, and it's coming, this threat is externalized. There's a rejection of general cultural modernization, everything from gay marriage, abortion rights, gender identity. These become very loaded issues within a kind of cultural war. And above all, we see a use of emotive language that plays on fear. And this has become very effective on social media, like I said, because it reaches new audiences. We have simple solutions to complex problems. Yeah, those were the points. These are just some of the hallmarks, like I said. We could probably get into the discussion and define it a lot further. I think it's important to say that populism is used by far-right and extreme-right parties. At the same time, traditional right-wing populists wouldn't completely reject the democratic system, but some do, and parts of the extreme far-right that completely reject the democratic system also adopt populist methods. So there is sort of like an overlap between what we mean by right-wing populism, far-right populism, and just the far extreme right. I've taken some examples here. The rest of the presentation is quite visual, so we can I'll skim through a few of these examples and maybe we can talk about them a bit longer in the discussion. Here are a few examples from the AFD in Saxony. So here we have, this is like their battle against old age poverty. They want an end to luxury pensions for politicians. So here we have this idea of, the elites. I mean, it's obviously, here we have actually a politician who you could argue belongs to this elite or establishment, but here in the eyes of the AFD, he's like a man of the people, and he's, stopping the politicians from, raking in all the money. Here we have a poster by the AFD in Saxony saying that the state should fund the building of streets instead of porno websites, which is also interesting because they've chosen themselves a highly sexualized image to prove this point. The actual site that was funded was just an ethical comparison site with information about whether porn sites have sexist or discriminatory information. So it wasn't actually a porn site of itself. It was actually something different. But here in the share pic format, and all of these share pics I've taken from social media accounts of the AFD, they've just reduced it to a very simplistic message to, it's very emotive language to sort of make people outraged. Here we have Islamic headscarves to ban them in schools. Interestingly, it just says Islamic headscarves here. It doesn't apply to all headscarves, it would seem. It also doesn't seem to apply to religious symbols more generally. There's a very simple idea of an enemy construct and a very clear focus here on Islamism being the threat and that which we need to ban. And more recently, heating with the Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. It's led to inflation. It's led to rising heating costs, and this has been a very big topic for the AfD in their populist messaging on social media. So here we have a 66% of people in Saxony have to swap their heatings as part of a government heating scheme at the moment as well in order to meet climate goals. And they've come up with the slogan, "Keine Heizung ist illegal," no heating is illegal, which is a play on a pro-refugee slogan that basically says that no one is illegal. The idea of like people coming over, risking their lives, escaping war zones, etc. That the idea that this is being criminalized, and this was coming from progressive movements. So they just co-opted this phrase and turned it into their own kind of like plump populist slogan and saying that like no heating is illegal here. And here's actually a picture recently of the AfD in the regional parliament in Lower Saxony, holding up posters in the style of the original slogan, pro-refugee slogan, proclaiming that heating shouldn't be criminalized, basically. To sort of bring back my point to the beginning again, so we looked at like the traditional far-right neo-Nazi posters from like Die Rechte, NPD, and I think the success of the Alternative für Deutschland has been able to reach people that traditionally wouldn't have necessarily been mobilized or activated by these very aggressive populist sloganing, for example, Maria statt Sharia. But essentially, we have the same message. So now, recently, the AfD campaigned on the ticket of burqas, we're more into bikinis, as their slogan. And essentially, they mean the same thing, but the AfD has found a way to communicate these populist messages in a way that seems more national conservative and less openly neo-Nazi, even though often the same thing is meant and it's activating some of the same people. Another example would be, here is Stop the Great Replacement by the Identarian movement, which is a far-right movement. The Great Replacement is an anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim conspiracy theory that Jews or other elites are behind a secret plan to exchange the population of Europe through mass migration and refugees. So there's this idea of like the ethno-nationalist people is under threat by migration. So we have this idea of threat again. And if you look at like this is like a far-right street movement. This is right-wing extremists. But then if you look at what the youth wing of the AfD are saying, they're using exactly the same narrative, maybe just in slightly brighter blue colors. And here they're warning against how many mosques are in the federal state of Nordrhein-Westfalen. And they're also saying, stop the Islamization, stop the Great Replacement. So I think in both these examples, we're seeing how the AfD is using right-wing populism to essentially reach new audiences, but say ultimately that which far-right and neo-Nazi parties have been saying for years and decades. Above all, I would say crises are a fuel for populism, and this applies to the AfD a lot. So in 2015, we had the summer of migration. Over 1 million refugees came to Germany. 2020, we had the COVID pandemic. 2022, we had Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Then, of course, we had inflation and energy crisis, and the next crisis is sure to come. But all of these crises, the AfD has been able to instrumentalize and capitalize when it comes to online right-wing propaganda and populist sentiment. And just to finish off my presentation, I wanted to look a bit like what's the new development. So yeah, share pics maybe seems like quite an obvious point of how the AfD are now reaching new audiences. Artificial intelligence is the next big thing in lots of areas at the moment. Here are two examples by an AfD MP. On the left, we have Karl Lauterbach, the health minister, basically saying we need to expose his lies. And here we have him sort of stylized as a kind of zombie or mad scientist wanting to, inject us all with vaccinations. So we have a demonization of him. And on the right, we have, I don't know if this was supposed to be modeled on Robert Habeck or not, but we have this idea of some demon with EU wings coming to take our motors from our cars, fuel motors. And in both cases, I see it's a worrying trend because if you can just, type in a few prompts and get like the direct enemy image you're looking for, this can be very dangerous. So The last example is this was done by the same MP from the AfD, Norbert Kleinwächter. Here he's just generated what he perceives to be as like a horde of aggressive migrants to deliver the image that he wishes to use to instill fear in his voters. And the slogan here, it says, "No to more refugees." So this is a very worrying trend that you can, just type in this and create these images to further your hateful messages. So just to finish off, I thought it would only be fair to type in my own AI prompt. AfD politician Norbert Kleinwächter sitting in front of an AI interface trying to create racist images. And that's the image that came up. He doesn't actually look anything like that, but I thought two can play at this game, so enjoy. That was my presentation, 15 minutes exactly. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.